Welcome to the Week in Sports Cars on the Marshall Pruett podcast, presented to you by Cooper Tires and the Justice Brothers and DailySportsCar.com editor Graham Goodwin, who is just back from the Asian Le Mans Series finale in Malaysia. How you doing, my friend?
I'm good. Actually got some decent sleep on a flight back from the East for once, and feeling good at the moment. I'm sure I'll hit the wall at some point. It's just coming into the evening here in the UK, so it's something like 30 degrees cooler than it was this time yesterday for me, so that's a bit of an adjustment. Back with the heating on, I'm afraid, my friend.
I've never been to Malaysia, but I am told that it is like the worst versions of humidity that one might find in the U.S. in Florida or Houston, where it feels like a dog is breathing in your face all day. But if you happen to like the sensation of a dog breathing in your face, I think we now know where you need to spend the rest of your life. So you, Mr. Goodwin, had a great idea. And one of the things that we do here on the Week in Sports Cars is rapidly adapt, just as teams and drivers do. You said, hey, we could record our normal listener-driven Q&A Week in Sports Cars episode today, or should we do a special feature, a shorter episode for sure, a shorter feature looking at what you think, I'd say we, but really I'm just the person who will be asking you the questions because you are the smart one on the subject. Should we do a short feature ahead of Friday's release of the final approved entries for the 24 Hours of Le Mans? And I would say any normal year, this might not be a concept for a special edition, knowing how this has not been a normal year, my friend, in terms of how our friends at the ACO and the FIAWC have chosen to release a partial entry list, huge question marks as to why some marquee teams and entries were left off that initial one. It seems to have been such a curious and possibly confusing process specifically for the 2019 event. You said, hey, why don't we get into who we think is going to round out the entry list that gets announced here in 48 hours or so or less, but also bring us up to speed on where we've been with this entry list procedure. So let's just start there, brother, with what have we had so far for those who are maybe catching up as well, before we get into who you think will round out the four classes coming up here for the June Classic.
Yeah, it's a good call. And we of course know there's going to be 60 cars to start the Le Mans 24 Hours in June. The surprise was that we were told to expect the first 50, of course, just a couple of weeks ago. That didn't happen. We got 42 and not 50. Now, there's a fair amount of supposition involved here, but there's also a fair amount of common sense applied to the cars that perhaps you might have expected to be in that first 50, included not just the full season WC entries, which we got, with the exception of the two Ginetto LMP1s, of which more in a moment. Not just those cars from the auto entries that have thus far been won, which we got, which told us which teams had decided to take up those auto entries and which hadn't. But we didn't hear about the additional GTE Pro entries from the GTLM class in the IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Series that you might reasonably have expected to be part of that first 50. Supposition then is, and there's a fair amount of evidence behind this, is that it's a tricky year for the selection committee, which includes senior people from the ACO and their partner championships, between taking again, effectively for the third year, a substantial chunk of additional pro cars from IMSA, or in a period where we know things are looking quite choppy for the ACO and particularly for the FIWC in real transition for their LMP1 class, whether or not they should look towards their own direct customers for the full season particularly in LMP2 from the ELMS, where because of the way that things have actually panned out, particularly because of the numbers of pro cars wanting to come from IMSA, that number was looking, frankly, a little low for a championship, which this season has got 18 LMP2 cars. So where we are at the moment is 42 have been named. A further 4 were decided in Malaysia with the results of the Asia Le Mans series. So we can talk a little bit about those 4 because they're an interesting quartet, which then leaves us with 14 places still to be decided. So the numbers look like this. Yes to the 60. We're still definitely going to get that. We've had 42. We've now had a further 4. We'll talk about those in a moment. That means that 14 more will be announced on Friday the 1st of March. And that will be a mix of GTE Pro and LMP2 cars for sure. The possibility that there might be a GTM car or 2. We'll talk about those possibilities. And we've still, of course, got the outside possibility that we might get one of those 2 Ginettas named, though I expect we may see one of those Ginettas actually on the reserve list as at best. So because we also know how many cars were actually entered, we know 75 entries were received, we can now gather that there are 29 entries in the mix for 14 available spaces. And it's not a difficult one to do the math, as I know our American cousins like to say, Marshall, missing out the essential S for those who speak the Queen's English. But that means that you've got less than a 1 in 2 chance of being selected. And I thought what might be quite a fun thing to do at this point is to go through what we know in terms of who definitely has put in those entries and see who you and I think might actually make that cut, because it's going to be a particularly difficult one this year for the ACO. And it also might be quite interesting to just debate some of the reasons why those choices might be made. So over to you, sir.
Well, we also should remind folks that this is a impromptu last-minute call made to do this entry list Week in Sports Cars special. We will still have our regular Week in Sports Cars episode. We're going to hold that till Friday, knowing that we've already received lots of questions. And with the anticipated release, again, I say anticipated because who knows what could happen this year with said information. Provided this comes out as intended, this is something that might lead to more questions that come in, and we'll try and roll those into our standard listener-driven Q&A Week in Sports Cars episode on Friday. All right, so we have a whole bunch of who we think will be named to the final spots on the 60-car entry list. Then there's the which one of those could, may, might, who knows, be on the reserve list. So I'm going to let you be our guide on that front. Let's start in LMP1. I know from the initial batch of 42 entries that were released, it seems like the ACO did a pretty good job of fleshing out the vehicles that will be in LMP1, but we think that there could be a couple of more.
Well, yeah, I mean, what I've done is to rack through my little knowledge base and see what I could do to find out what those 29 cars might be in total. I've come up with 27, and I've come up with a further 4 possibles. It obviously doesn't add up to 29, but there's a degree here of flexibility. There might be a surprise, so it's always worth looking at that list. LMP1, I think, is a reasonably simple one. We already know that the full season entry from the TRSM Ginetta team, those entries now back in the hands of the Ginetta factory. So the full season entry and the race by race car were both entered for Le Mans. We know that Ginetta have been told that is no. What I expect to see, I think there's possibility we may see one of those cars on a reserve list. We'll wait and see. Now, of course, both these cars with the AER P60B engine, I also expect that we may well see an entry request come for one of those cars for Spa. I think that's a distinct possibility. Now, that would be useful, I think, for 2 reasons. One is it does give the ACO the opportunity, and the WEC rather, the opportunity to take a look and see whether or not what's been going on with the development with that car has pushed things along any, and it gives the opportunity for Ginetta, should the cars come along and be quick and be competitive, to turn around to the WEC and to the ACO and go, Yabu sucks, you made a mistake there, didn't you? So let's wait and see whether or not that happens. I also think, by the way, we're going to see an unusually high number of race-by-race entries for the 6 hours of Spa that come along in May, and I think that number is going to be 3 or possibly rather more. We'll wait and see what happens in the intervening period, but we know from a story that I'm about to post on Daily Sports Car tomorrow that one of the Asian Le Mans Series successful entries will be posting an entry for the 6 hours of Spa. We also know that G-Drive Racing will be putting in their regular request, and I suspect that we're going to see that car, the 26 car, put in a request for next season's WEC as well. So there's things coming along nicely there. We might well have a quite nice grid for the 6 hours of Spa. Before then, though, we've got the joy that is going to be the doubleheader at Sebring, and we've got the remainder MP of these entries to be confirmed for what happens in June.
And I'll overstate the obvious here with the, hey, everything's going to be awesome, and boy, aren't those Ginettas going to be fast and wonderful, to a variety of team-based issues, questions over power plant efficiency, effectiveness, blah, blah, blah. Again, overstating something very obvious here, but I would not only welcome seeing a few Ginetta LMP1s on the Le Mans grid here, but also for the brand, just from a manufacturer health standpoint, have a fairly decent, uncomplicated run at Le Mans, because we're really, Graham, not at a point in whether it's domestic sports car racing or global sports car racing where we can afford to have a reputable name like Ginetta, one with significant history, falling out, faltering, struggling, or just simply being disinvited from the big show, possibly because of some of the relatively recent issues that were experienced, not all necessarily that were falling in line with whatever shortcomings related to the brand specifically. So it'd be a great boost to me.
It would be. I think it's worth adding as well. I mean, they've had a busy week this week. Just this morning, the wrap's taken off their brand new Whisper It hypercar, not car, but their brand new road car. Not something we've seen very much from Ginetta for quite a long time, but the Geneva show will see a brand new 600 horsepower V8 engined front mid-engine car unveiled by Ginetta. That they are making a great play of, owes a great deal to the technology they developed for the LMP1 car. This is an ambitious company. They've got a license for LMP3 with the new regulations. It remains to be seen whether or not they decide to put a bid in for the next round of LMP2 licenses. And yeah, I would like to see some evidence that the powers that be are trying to make this easier for Ginetta. I get it. I absolutely get it as to why the decision was taken not to invite those cars to the Le Mans 24 Hours. Frankly, for exactly the same reasons as I just stated, that it's difficult this year with GT Pro cars. I would like to see some evidence and hear some evidence back from our friends in Yorkshire and in the UK that there was a sit-down opportunity offered to find a pathway back for that program, because it would be tragic at a stage where the top class in ACO prototypes loses a manufacturer because, frankly, they had not the wrong customer per se, but the wrong funders that came forward and made commitments that were not delivered upon. I'll say it again. I've said it before. It is a source of great sorrow to me that a manufacturer finds himself unable to put cars that they have on the ground in the factory right now on the track, simply because of the way the regulations were put forward. Ginetta were not able to enter those cars as a factory team. because that's what the rules say you're not allowed to do. Neither were they allowed to actually enter as a factory team or as anything else on a race-by-race basis, because that's what the rules say about LMP1 as well. It needs to be sorted.
Speaking of sorting, we are going to move on to GTE Pro, and there are, I would say, Graham, of all the curiosity, of all the speculation as to why the proposed 50-car first entry list information dump was down to 42, we would probably say some of the omissions on that initial distribution. The big question marks were centered so heavily on GTE Pro. What do you think we're going to see on Friday in terms of confirming some of the names that we just figured were almost just copied year by year on the list of expectations?
Well, I think that there's a simple pair, and that is the Corvettes. It is unfeasible that Corvette will not get both their C7Rs in. 20th year of competition for Corvette racing, by some distance the longest surviving factory entry for the Le Mans 24 Hours in this modern era. So 20 consecutive years this year. That leaves us with what we believe are another 5 cars from the IMSA GTLM pack that have been entered. Got a rather odd tweet from Porsche, who may have been lost in translation, said that they would have 4 cars in GT Pro at the Le Mans 24 Hours. Well, that's not what the entry says so far, but I think it is fair to say that several sources have told me, and by the way, none of those sources from Porsche, that Porsche have already been told they have 4 entries for the Le Mans 24 Hours. I think they are the most likely to get the 4. For a variety of reasons, and we'll come to those when we discuss the other 2 brands that are involved in this mishmash. We then move to Ford in what is at the moment likely to be the very final time we'll see the Ford GTs in factory hands at the Le Mans 24 Hours, as well, of course, as Ben Keating's AM car. Here's where I think we start to get to a little bit more of the potential politics that might be in play here. So yes, we've got the issue I said a little earlier about the P2 cars and looking after the ACO's own customers at a time of transition. We then get into the politics of prototype racing. Yes, I know we're talking about GTLM and GTE Pro, but the politics of prototype racing at the moment are pretty nasty, I think it's fair to say. What we have here
How so,
is
Graham?
Porsche.
How so? This might be, again, realizing that not everybody listening knows the inside dirt. What's nutty about this?
Yeah, it comes down to hypercar, car, and DPI. It comes down to effectively a situation where, to the eternal shame of all involved, I'm afraid here, on both sides of the debate, people are being asked to take some sides. I don't like that. I don't like it at all. I don't like it one little bit. But the realities at the moment are that Porsche, whilst has certainly taken a look at hypercar, appear to be on the sidelines at the moment, but most certainly will be back with a full factory GTE Pro effort next season in the WEC, as well as I'm sure in IMSA. Ford, meanwhile, as we say, looks like it's the end of the road for the factory program in GTE Pro. After the Le Mans 24 Hours in the WEC, and are moving towards a variety of potential new programs, including the DPI side of things. So are we going to see a message delivered here, and may we see one? I can't believe, honestly, that both would be rejected, but might Ford get 3 and not 4? The advantage that gives to the selection committee, of course, is it frees up another car, another space for a full season entrant from the ELMS or from Asia or whatever, that would be a direct customer for the organisers' championship in Europe for the next 1 or 2 years. So the reality here is that there is a commercial reason to do that. We should also remember, by the way, that this recent boost in the GTE Pro field, whilst it's massively welcome, is a recent thing. We've not seen this year in, year out. You know, the years that we've had 4 factory cars, for the most part, it's been the last 1 or 2 years. Yes, it's very welcome. Yes, it adds some commercial punch in the paddock at the Le Mans 24 Hours, but it's not something that has a long tradition here. It's been a very recent thing, principally because of the kind of trimming back of the LMP1 hybrid field. So it is a real debate. For me, I think we'll see 2 Corvettes. I think we'll see 2 Porsches. I think we'll see possibly 3 Fords. There seems to be a kind of, for me, a fairness that if you're going to trim one factory team, you'd trim another as well. But let's wait and see what comes out of that. But that still leaves us MP with one final IMSA GTLM that we do know has requested an entry, and that is fan favourites Risi Competizione. And I fear they may be another victim here. And they may be another victim, not necessarily because of the politics, although that certainly has something to play in terms of what we may believe have been the choices at the moment of Ferrari in relation to their proposed car program. It seems to be falling victim at the moment to the cost issue that is striking those regulations. But more to the point, the Risi Competizione have not committed to a full season of racing anywhere. And there is a regulation that states that in order to take up an entry for the Le Mans 24 Hours, you must take up a full season entry in an ACO sanctioned championship or in IMSA. That's what it says. Now, yes, there have been exceptions to that rule, but there is a rule there that I'm afraid does catch out the fabulous number 62 car. So let's wait and see what comes there as well. But for me, we're 2 classes in, LMP1 and GTE Pro, with a potential 9 cars, and I think we may see 4 of them.
I'll just
5 of them. Sorry, 5 of them.
No worries. I'll go ahead and throw in here another obvious Marshall Pruett statement. The so heavily restricted levels and layers of funneling and just shaping how one can participate at Le Mans. As you just mentioned, you must be a full-time entrant here or there. Again, it's theirs. It's their event to do with as they please. I don't know if the average person cares. I don't know if the average fan knows about it or would have reason to question what they're doing. I'll just try and bring a little bit of very fast, call it old-time perspective, and that being, if we're speaking about traditions, and we're just speaking about what has been part of, in my opinion, the charm of Le Mans, it's the interesting non-full pro, non-full-time entries that have been accepted throughout the years. And so I guess I can understand on one end wanting to make the race as professional as possible, and only those who are fully committed to a season of racing with their, ACO/FIA /IMSA sanctioned championships would be allowed. I don't know if we are in a place where we are more or less killing off the chance for small privateer entries, or even a big privateer entry, even a factory. If they just said, hey, we just want to go and do Le Mans. We don't really want to do Spa. We don't want to do whichever. We're going to do tons of testing on our own. We're going to just coat the world with private testing, all to then just show up at Le Mans and be victorious. Or again, these smaller, ambitious garagistes. I don't know, man. There's a part of me that just gets really sad when I think about the fact it is becoming almost impossible for such an entry to compete at Le Mans these days. Also knowing that so many auto entries are provided. And
one more next year, and one more for next year, because next year there will be an additional auto entry for the second place car in the LMS, and that's in part
absolutely
MP.
Sure.
You know, a response to exactly the point you raise. I agree with you. I mean, having lived through the latter part of the era before we got into this insistence there must be a full season aspect to the entry. And of course, a lot of that was reason behind that was because there weren't ACO accredited events until the early part of the 21st century. 2004, with the start of the Le Mans Endurance Series, later the Le Mans Series, later the ELMS, ILMC, and then we get into WEC days. What we did see were a number of entries, some of which were frankly a bit shambolic. In let's not forget either a smaller entry at the Le Mans 24 Hours. It's only been the last few years we've had 60. That did mean that what you got was, well, a fair number of tail-end Charlies. I agree with you. Some of the charm of it has gone. Some of the kind of the unexpected part of the early part of that week, where you get people coming in something that unfeasibly, emerges as a potential contender. And yet, I think that's gone, and I think that's probably gone forever, I'm afraid. But what we've got as a result of the pyramid that's now been put in is some real stability, and in particular, some real stability in the Continental Series, and in part through the good work of the likes of Don Panos and Scott Atherton and the like. What we had with the American Le Mans Series, and then through into the merger with Grand Am into the modern day IMSA Series, is a great example of that. The strength there was because some bodies sat down and thought, wouldn't this be a great thing if what we had was a stable year-round platform for factories and privateers to show off their wares, and we profit from it. But actually, you're absolutely right, MP. There is just that little aspect, the romance, if you like, of sports car racing. A little part of that, I'm afraid, looks like it's now ever more distant history.
I would just say that the anticipation of the entry list coming out and the notion leading up to it of who's going to be on it, who might be on it, which unknowns, which interesting, which little Davids might we root for against the Goliaths, seems to be changing, if not almost completely changed, to which entries, to our great surprise, will be denied. And so the anticipation of what, at least for me, the anticipation of the full entry list's release is, again, more of who have they shut out that we might not be able to fully rationalize why that took place. So I'll just close with saying things like this. I don't want to say we can never go back. I will say that, reaction to such harsh things can often lead to a change, and saying, we have made things too hard to allow aspirational entries to take place. I don't know if it will change, but I do know that whether it's like many other things in life, sometimes when things go so hard to the left or to the right, it's not a total surprise to see things snap back maybe towards the middle at some point if there's collective agreement that needs to happen. All right, LMP2, Mr. Goodwin, is a whole big heck-a-bunch large list of possibilities with names of teams and potential entries from all manner of ELMS, Asian Le Mans Series, IMSA, WEC, blah, blah, blah. That, boy,
absolutely.
Lots here, my friend. Tell us where
we
might find.
Well, I'm certain that I've got 14 entries from the 29 that still remain in the hat nailed, and I think I know there's another couple of possibles. And there's some of these are quite easy, I think, at this stage to dispense with, but then again, we don't know one part of the kind of the mix, and I'll come to that a little bit in the moment. When we sit and, I've had a couple of people stop me in paddocks and say, when you write this stuff, how do you come to those conclusions? Well, there's some easy things, the easy conclusions you come to make. There's one or two that others would disagree with, but I'll chuck it into the mix anyway.
In addition to
and then there's some
very convenient.
Yes. Then there's some unknowns, and the two unknowns is we don't know which driver has been nominated for these cars, because they will nominate the car with a single driver, and of course, if there is a named driver, a driver that the selection committee believe will put people on the gate, that could very well be, a factor. The other thing that will be in the entry will be, amongst other things, information about the lead sponsor for the entry. So, for instance, if a major international consumer brand is associating itself with a high-profile GT or LMP2 entry, or LMP1 entry for that matter, then of course that becomes that bit more appealing in terms of an entry. We are not going to get to know most of that on Friday. We will see which drivers have been nominated. There might well be a couple of surprises there. But for now, I'm going to restrict myself to the other factors. There is one factor I'll name up front. It's not very popular with a certain section of society.
Christoph Bouchou.
Well, oddly enough, not a million miles away, because it is. We can't ignore the fact that whilst this is the biggest race in the world, and you want to debate that, that's fine. But okay, I'll give you this. Whatever the debate, it's certainly the biggest endurance race in the world, but it is a race in France. And that means that you would expect, with the French public and the French media taking a massive interest in this, that there has to be every chance of a more than decent French level of representation. And the best class for that in terms of numbers is LMP2. And there are, as I count down my little list here, 1, 2, 3, 4 high-profile French teams, none of which at the moment have an entry for the Le Mans 24 Hours. And of those 4 high-profile French teams, 3 of them I know have put in 2 entries apiece. I think we're going to see 1 car apiece from each of those 4 French squads. Panis Barthez competition with one of their Ligier JSP 217s. Duquesne Engineering, who will have entered a single car, and we'll come back to Duquesne in a moment. Graf Racing, principally because the car that they're entering will have co-branding from the SO24 consortium of regional businesses in the South region. So that is important in terms of the local political side of things with a small p for the ACO. And EDEX Sports, who will, I'm sure, get their Orica in there. Graf, by the way, will be an Orica as well, as will Duquesne Engineering. Duquesne Engineering, if listeners to this podcast are not that familiar with Duquesne Engineering, excellent season in the LMS last season, but principally as well because they are now the organisation that a different arm of their group now runs the Norma LMP3 concern, which means that they are heavily invested in another ACO LMP3 class. So I think shoe in for each of those 4 with pretty high profile crews for each of them, that would end up being the French representation in LMP2. Beyond that, we then talk about some cars that may be in a little bit more trouble, or certainly will be on the cusp. Dragon Speed have an LMP2 entry already in from the WEC. They have an LMP1 entry in from the WEC. And my belief this season is that will be the cap. I think the Dragon Speed entry of the LMS might well fall. I think that could be interesting. There are all sorts of rumours as to what might happen if the LMP2 entry for the LMS gets in. Do they do a reshuffle? Or might you see different faces in the LMP1 car than the full season WEC? Mike Enrique Hedman preferred to do Le Mans in a P2 than a P1 car. I'm not sure they're going to get the chance to find out. So we'll wait and see what happens with that. We then get to 2 teams that field the Dallara P217. Cetelar Villorba Corsa from last year will be Cetelar Racing this coming year. They don't feature this year on the ELMS list. They will be doing the Monza race as a one-off and then will join the FIWC. Great little team from Italy. Andrea Bellicchi coming back in to replace Felipe Nasra, who's now obviously over with you guys full season in IMSA MP. They had a dreadful season, though, last year in the ELMS, barely scoring, frankly, through the season. Horrible luck, couple of incidents and accidents, and certainly some real problems with the reliability of their package. Their ace in the hole, though, is that they are very commercially active at the racetrack. Lots of business-to-business work going on with Cetelar Racing. But more than that, that they've committed already to a full season of the FI World Endurance Championship. Might that make the difference for the Italian team? We'll wait and see. It could come down to a choice for the ACO between the Zettelar Racing team and a team that until now has campaigned Dalara's, but will henceforth be campaigning Oreca's in Europe and Dalara's in Asia, because High Class Racing have waited and waited patiently, like the gentlemen they are, for
it's a very
an
high
opportunity.
class move on their part, by the way.
It's a massively
I'd
high
feel
class.
bad if I left that one hanging there.
But High Class Racing will be, I think, waiting very patiently to see whether or not they finally get a yes from the selection committee. Their calling card is that they are back in the ELMS this year with a brand new Oreca and a spare Oreca for that matter. And they've already committed to a campaign with 2 Dallara Gibsons for the next season of the Asian Le Mans Series. A very valuable entry indeed for the ACO. I have little doubt that that's the reason why they've done it, but they are very serious about it. If you were listening to Inside the Sports Car Racing Paddock this week from Sepang, you'll have heard Anders Fjordbæk, very close, of course, to the team, talking about that program. And I think they too have got that calling card. They're another team with, a chip in the game. The only other team with solely a kind of an Asian calling card is Eurasia, who've been to Le Mans before, of course. They were the base for Tracy Crone recent season. They have access to Alicia JSP 217. I'm afraid for me this year, I think it's a big ask to see Mark Goddard's team coming. They weren't successful in winning an entry via the Asia Le Mans Series with, whilst they tried to get a 3-car entry in 3 different classes this year, actually only managed to get a single LMP3. There will again be news later this week of their plans for the next Asia Le Mans Series, which does include LMP3 and LMP2 for next season. But I fear that Mark might have to wait another year. If you're counting through these, you'll realise that leaves us with 1, 2, and that may be it. 3 teams still to talk about. Let's talk about United Autosports. Richard Dean and co will be delighted with winning 1 class in the Asia Le Mans Series. At one point during that race, they stood with the possibility and the points as they stood during the race of winning 3 out of the 4 classes. But bad luck for 2 of their entries. One with racing luck, the other one with gearbox problem for their LMP2 AM squad, means they came away at least with 1, but will badly want a second. And I think they should get 1. This is a team that's committed, count them, 11 cars across 3 ACO license series, plus the cars that raced at Daytona and the car that went on to race at Sebring and Watkins Glen in IMSA. But 11 cars across the European Le Mans Series, the Michelin Le Mans Cup and Asia Le Mans Series is a massive contribution to the sport. They always bring a very high quality effort and very high quality drivers to those efforts. And my view, MP, I'd be very happy to hear yours too, is I think they've done more than enough to deserve a second car at the Le Mans 24 Hours. Beyond that, we've got, who else is left? Well, 1 team remaining. But 1 team that will be on that list potentially with 2 very different names. And that the name is Algarve Pro Racing. 2 cars apiece in Europe and Asia this year. Won the race at Sepang with their lead car. Great effort from that trio with Harrison Newey, who takes his bow from prototype racing for a little while, is going off to race in Super Formula, Super Taikyu and Super GT. Lots of super there for Harrison Newey, the son of aerodynamic guru Adrian Newey, of course, from Andrea Pizzitola. And Attila de Jong, gentleman driver for Algarve Pro Racing. They have a car entered, an Oreca entered under their own name. And then there's one of the other things that is going to be a massive talking point on Friday. What is going to happen about 2 all-female crews that are entered for the Le Mans 24 Hours this year. The Michael Shank Racing efforts, sponsored by Caterpillar, exactly the same kind of package that you'll, if you're followers of the IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship, have seen on the beautiful Acura NSX GT3, is entered for the Le Mans 24 Hours with an a very, very capable all-female crew. And they are waiting patiently to find out what happens on Friday. The reason I mention Algarve Pro Racing there is because that will be a collaboration between Michael Shank Racing and Algarve Pro Racing for the Le Mans 24 Hours, and we'll wait and see how that one actually all pans out. Of those 14, I think one or other from Settler and High Class will be in. I think United will be in. As I say, I think one each of the 4 French teams will get in. And then we have to wait and see. And I think the next thing I'd like to talk about, MP, as we get into GTE-AM, are those 2 all-female crews.
And I think that's a perfect little point to stop and explore, knowing that the FIA in particular, obviously being half of the organization that puts on or that takes part in the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the FIA has been very steadfast in promoting women in racing, not just the driving side, but engineering, management, and otherwise, not calling them out to therefore highlight the fact that I don't seem to recall a similar or complementing program from the ACO, but I think at least my thoughts and initial reactions to this was, Graham, we'll see how, if and how much, the influence of the FIA in this relationship might pan out in regards to the all-female entries. Again, were this strictly an ACO initiative, then I would say it would be almost just a formality. We will see both, if not seemingly any and all female teams invited to the race. The fact that this is not something that took root with the ACO, but is indeed something that is very held in very high regard and importance by their partners at the FIA. That's where there's question marks as to whether the ACO will acquiesce and say yes, or if there might be a little bit of pushback for reasons, admittedly, I can't think of any solid reason for, but sometimes tribal lines get drawn.
Well, let's go through all of that, because we've got a number of projects underway at the moment. As we say, there's the Jackie Heinricher established program with MSR in IMSA. The FIA coordinated, Richard Mille funded efforts in the Asia Le Mans series. We've seen, to be blunt, rather stagger through the first 3 races and then finally started to get some momentum right at the end of the season. I'm sure that will carry on into the 2019-2020 season in LMP3, that saw a cracking trio actually at the final race, which oddly had some parallels, and we'll come into those in a moment, between the 2 efforts we're about to talk about. Margot Lafitte, the daughter of F1 legend Jacques Lafitte, in the car, Cat Leg. And again, you'll have heard Catherine in the podcast we brought to you from Sepang, and Michelle Gatting, who will be part of the Kessel Racing effort. That will be a full season GTE entry in the European Le Mans series, one of 2 cars that Kessel Racing will be bringing to GTE for the first time in the European Le Mans series, and that car is the second entry. It will be the 3 female drivers that will enter the European Le Mans series, I believe, that will be entered for the Le Mans 24 Hours as well. Let's get into some of those points here. Number 1, do I think it is a highly valid process to actually to show the talents of these teams, and these ladies in particular in those teams? Yes, I do. Do I think the world's greatest endurance race can afford 2 entries for untried trios together, and untried in the case of the MSR gals rather, that have not raced in LMP2 together? Yes, I do. And I think it would be wonderful to see both those crews on the grid. it's going to be interesting which way this goes, and I hope to God that politics does not come into this. I really, truly hope that we don't get any nonsense about one team getting the nod over the other for any reasons other than that they're the best people to be there. This is a race that has always had room for the opportunity for stories beyond the blindingly obvious. So the Garage 56 programs in the past, were never going to be cars that came and won that race or even competed for that race. When you look back at some of the stories that emerged from those projects, the Nissan Delta Wing, for instance, and particularly Frederic Sausset's SRT41 effort, they added immeasurably to the newsworthiness of an already internationally renowned event. So I hope, personally, what we see or hear about on Friday is that both Kessel Racing and Michael Shank Racing do make it onto that list. I apologise to anybody that is going to be just beyond that line. On this occasion, I think, guys, it's time to take one for the team, because this is an important issue. And if what this means is that more young women come forward, encouraged by what they can see in international competition, and feel more welcome in what still feels like a family, I think this time it's a price worth paying. I just hope that the selection committee remember the people just below that line and remember them with sympathy when it comes for selection in 2020, because there are going to be, or as always, people are going to be disappointed more than once. That, for me, MP, that's the story about the all-female crews. So again, to reiterate, it will be a GTM car in the mix for Kessel Racing. They've already got one car in as their ELMS entry. We've already seen that one has been put forward, but the all-female crew is there as well. And Michael Shank Racing, with the assistance, I believe, of Algar Pro Racing in the mix as well in LMP2. That leaves us, in terms of my list of cars that I'm certain have entered, with 3 more, at least, in GTE AM that will be up for consideration.
So why don't we move on to not only GTE AM and then also the quote other possibilities,
yes,
to close our somewhat surprised and hopefully somewhat abbreviated special edition of the Week in Sports Cars, presented to you by Cooper Tires and the Justice Brothers. Ahead of Friday's full, regular, normal You Ask the Questions, we hopefully provide some answers that aren't completely stupid. The Week in Sports Cars episode.
Right, so that basically leaves us, in terms of the ones that I'm absolutely certain I put in entry, with 3 more GTM cars. One is the Spirit of Race Ferrari. Spirit of Race, of course, a trading name for AF Corsa. And the car we're talking about here is the number 55 car from the European Le Mans Series. That is Duncan Cameron's car. Duncan, loyal servant of endurance racing over now several years, served his time, climbed the order, has raced at Le Mans before, but was a very unlucky first reserve last year. Raced well, raced for the title in the LMS, fell short of the top 2 positions, which means he didn't get an automatic entry. Will be in the mix if another GT car is going to be accommodated on the list. I have a horrible feeling that if the vote goes to the all-female crew this year, he is going to be the most unlucky man on that list this year. We'll wait and see. Beyond that, EB Motors, who were elevated to the Le Mans 24 Hours last year, courtesy of their Michelin Le Mans Cup place, I think may be unlucky this year in their lovely, lovely 911 RSR. And Lusich Racing, I know, Swiss Enter team, will be in the ELMS this year, and I believe that team as well has applied for an entry to the Le Mans 24 Hours. They're the cars I'm certain are there. If you add all of that little lot together, it comes to 27. So you're therefore looking for another couple that might have. There is one unknown, simply because I've not been able to raise the team principal for a conversation about it. That is a team called Racing Engineering. Very successful team in single-seater racing, came to P2 last year with an Oreca in the European Le Mans Series, won their very first race at Paul Ricard, went on to finish second in the European Le Mans Series. By that reckoning, if this was next year, they'd be going to Le Mans. They're not going to Le Mans at the moment, and they've not entered the LMS either. I think we will see racing engineering emerging in GT3 racing pretty soon, but because they've not entered an ACO championship, I fear we will not see racing engineering back at the Le Mans. This is a team that raced some 20 years ago in GT cars, but they weren't successful last year. Beyond that, I'm beginning to get into guesswork. Did Project 1, Project 1, the GTM leading squad in the FIWC, did they put a second entry in? They've already confirmed they're coming to the LMS in 2019. They confirmed to my colleague Stephen Kilby just a week or so ago that they've obtained a second Porsche 911 RSR and intend to be back in the WEC as well. I think that sort of signals, MP, that they might be looking for a two-car entry this year at the Le Mans 24 Hours. In the same vein, we also know, and we've known for some time, that Mike Wainwright at Gulf Racing UK has a second Porsche 911 RSR. Mike have put in a second entry for his second car. And beyond that, you're then getting into new additions to the LMP2 grid. I'm certainly not aware that either of the current IMSA LMP2 teams, either PR1 Matterson or indeed Performance Tech, have put an entry, but they might have. BHK Motorsports, the surprise addition to the LMS grid this year with an Oreca, that's the sort of team that just might have decided, let's give it a spin and see which way it goes. It is, for me, MP, the tightest call for the selection committee in quite some years. We have seen much bigger numbers in the recent past, bidding for entries for the Le Mans 24 Hours, over 90 in the past. But in those years, an awful lot of those were pretty easy to actually put into the waste paper basket of doom, rather than being particularly serious players. It is going to be a very interesting list. There will be debate and there will be argument whichever way this goes, because make no mistake, either some professional cars are going to be out or on a reserve list, or you're going to find there is a higher proportion than many would deem acceptable of full season LMP2s out and or on the reserve list. And are we going to be at the cusp of a debate about positive discrimination around the women in motorsport debate, or are the ACO going to put themselves right at the vanguard of that movement on the biggest racing stage of all?
I just had an idea that's probably going to be filed in the very deep well of bad ideas that have come from my brain. But I'm going to throw this out, knowing that probably no one other than you and I and our dear listeners will hear it. Throw this out. Again, feel free to tell me it's dumb, as you normally do. 60 entries that will be confirmed for the race. There will be a specific number of reserve entries that could fill in if needed. For whatever reason, some of those fall out. We know that there would be, in theory, well more than the 10 reserves in place. Here's an idea. 24 Hours of Le Mans starts with a grid of 80 cars, maximum of 80 cars. It will pare itself down to 60 by midnight. So assuming we have, say, a 3 o'clock start on Saturday, at 4 p.m., the last 2 cars, period, in the field are out. Maybe we could say the entire field, because there might be some stragglers, might be some trying to recover from crash damage, who knows. Or maybe we just go with class by class. And I realize that might need to be weighted by entry size per class. If we have one class that has relatively few entries, obviously you might want to be a little softer on how many cars are plucked out of that. But part of me thinks if we have so many folks trying to get into a race, why not let them start and simply use the strongest survive, The weakest do not. And every hour we pluck 2 off of the grid and tell you to go home. Again, I'm not saying this is ever going to be adopted, and I realize it's dumb, and I'm just throwing it into the end of the conversation, but a part of me thinks, going back to your note earlier, through a lot of work over many years, we have the highest degree of stability at Le Mans. We have so many affiliated championships, Asian Le Mans Series, ELMS, IMSA, and whatnot that feed into the event each year, automatic entries. There's so many folks that appear have the ability and willingness to turn up, just waiting to find out if they will be among the fortunate who do receive permission to compete. Part of me thinks, well, if you have an interest and the ability to participate, then maybe we should find ways to allow you in and just start picking off the ones that are not performing particularly well. I know that we have the issues of garage size, again, and I'm not saying this would ever happen. Just a part of me says, boy, if you have a lovely problem of more people wanting to compete in your good event than you might be willing to allow, it's maybe worth considering how do we accommodate them, and then just use their own performances, either a lack of performance or just misfortune that has knocked them back in their class, and say, okay, we gave you a chance, you didn't measure up, thanks for coming, thanks for investing. You, like every other competitor, have a chance to prove you deserve to stay in the race, and for whatever reason you did not, but at least we gave you a chance to be here and hopefully show that you not only deserve but can make it to the finish line and potentially receive another entry for next year. So again, pulling this one out of my backside, but just a thought.
But yeah, I think there is a degree of yes and no in my answer to that one, MP, and I know for a lot of the fan base, the era of pre-qualifying, which died out at the end of the 90s, is a beloved time. So many stories that came out of pre-qualifying. If you're not familiar with that, there was, in the same way we've got a test day now, there was pre-qualifying, which meant that effectively you had to do it competitively. You had to go along on the main circuit and actually produce the goods. That died out, as I say, at the end of the 1990s. We got into a different era with more endurance racing available worldwide, and in a continental fashion as well, that we got into a different kind of rhythm of that. But is there a place for a competitive element to finish the last few places on the grid? The problem, of course, comes if you've got teams from the US, if you've got teams from Europe, if you've got teams from Asia. What do? Do you ask them to turn up to the test day and tell them that there's 4 cars, but there's only going to be 2 possible places there? Do you do it on the basis that they've got to pre-declare their Le Mans crews and they've got to get within whatever percentage of the fastest car in the class? What should it be? I'd be interested in people's points for Twisk at the end of this week on that one, MP. But for me, there have been more occasions in my time covering this that the selection committee have got it right rather than wrong. There have been some standout occasions when the decisions they've made have had cries of anguish around the world, and a number of those. But I don't in any way belittle the task. I'll say it again, because there will, whatever the way this goes, there will be a lot of public comment and criticism of whatever the decisions are. I would just ask our listeners to remember this: for the most part, and certainly in the modern era, the people responsible for the Le Mans 24 Hours have been very good guardians of that race. They've almost always produced a highly competitive field of an international standard for that fantastic platform. There are always going to be reasons why those decisions are taken. And the reality is that you, Marshall, and you guys, the listeners out there, don't have to agree with them on those reasons. That it's not an individual choice. It is a committee that actually makes this choice. And it will be a mix of competitiveness and commercial viability and newsworthiness that will determine who you're going to see in those last 14 places. What I've laid out this evening for you is my best guess of who's going to get the nod and who is going to be in a little bit more trouble. Should say, by the way, didn't give you the answer on Algarve Pro Racing. I'd like to see them get a car in on their own right. They are an archetypal privateer pro-am team. And I think they'll have a highly competitive team at one side of the garage if both of those are in. And unusually, all three of those drivers will be female. And they'll have a sharply traditional pro-am trio in the other. And there should always be place at the Le Mans 24 Hours for exactly that on the grid. Not every car, but a proportion of the cars. Because that is what the Le Mans has meant to me from the very beginning.
I think that sounds like a wonderful essay, What Le Mans Means to Me by Graham Goodwin. All right, I think we are done with our little special episode, my friends. So why don't we set sail on this Le Mans entry list conversation brought to us by our friends at Cooper Tires and the Justice Brothers. And dear listeners, we will look forward to getting back to you on Friday with our standard week in... I was about to say Week in IndyCar. I'm a bad man. That's because I'm about to record the Week in IndyCars. Week in Sports Cars episode here with our man Graham Goodwin. If you are listening now, don't be afraid to send in more questions either now on the entry list or as you see it pop up on Friday from our friends in France. And with that said, Graham, thank you, brother. Get more rest, and we will speak to you at the end of the week.